Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're navigating a really tricky subject. Claims of injury, adverse events, following the mRNA COVID-19 shots.
Yeah, and our main source here is that recent discussion featuring Jan Bonte. We're pulling from a YouTube interview where he lays out his take on scientific papers, adds personal stories.
And his own observations about potential harms.
Exactly. But it's really crucial, right off the bat, to be clear about our goal here.
Right.
We're not here to, validate or debunk these claims ourselves.
Yeah.
What we are doing is trying to unpack what Mr. Bonte actually presented in that interview, pulling out the main arguments, the details he used.
Kind of giving people a roadmap to understand his perspective on this, well, very complicated issue.
Precisely. A structured look based purely on the information he shared.
Okay, so let's maybe start with where Jan Bonte is coming from. His background, he mentioned his earlier work. Some people might remember or dive into that.
The Wuhan lab origins.
Yeah, and interestingly, he talked about a big update to that. Thousands of documents, apparently, from someone called Jill Demon.
Right. So it shows he's been, actively involved in digging through complex scientific info and investigations for some time now.
It kind of sets a baseline for how he approaches this stuff.
I think so. His methodology in the Wuhan investigation probably informs how he's looking at the vaccine data now. It suggests a pattern of engaging with these intricate scientific and, frankly, geopolitical puzzles.
And he definitely dives into that geopolitical context, too. He has his own interpretation of, why intelligence agencies might be releasing certain information now.
He links it to global power shifts, doesn't he?
Right.
And a specific focus on China.
Yeah, he mentions wife being removed, Kennedy taking over, Bhattacharya, someone like that.
Right.
And he seems to think these personnel changes could actually impact, scientific integrity within U.S. institutions.
It's a complex web he's weaving there.
He even mentioned a specific claim, something about the U.S. potentially putting mRNA vaccines on hold for new trials, specifically related to putting them on the childhood schedule.
That's a significant claim. If we zoom out, Bonte seems to be suggesting this interplay between, let's say, geopolitical maneuvering and maybe questions about scientific honesty.
Okay.
And that this backdrop could be influencing how vaccine safety data is, perceived or managed. And yeah, if there were a pause on mRNA shots for kids in the U.S., that would absolutely be major news. It would raise a lot of questions.
Definitely. Now, this next bit is really, really key to understanding his current stance, I think.
Okay.
Bonte states pretty clearly that his view has changed. He's become more critical of vaccination programs generally.
Right, though he does add a caveat, doesn't he?
He does. He clarifies he doesn't think, for instance, the entire Dutch national program is flawed, but then he says he can't really give specific advice on individual vaccines.
Why is that?
Because, he says, it would just take an enormous amount of research for every single one.
That itself raises a good point, actually, about the level of scrutiny we apply to different vaccines and maybe the schedules. Bonte is suggesting that even established programs aren't beyond questioning. That's a key takeaway from his perspective. And him pulling back from giving specific advice, it just underscores how incredibly complex it all is.
Yeah, the sheer volume of information needed for each case.
Exactly.
He also briefly mentioned his books on the Wuhan lab, the trilogy.
Oh, yeah. How are they doing?
Apparently still doing well. Lots of interest. He had to update them. Shows there's still a demand for that kind of deep dive into complex scientific events.
Well, maybe that same appetite for, in-depth understanding is fueling the interest in the vaccine information he's presenting now. People want to get behind the headlines.
Could be. Now, shifting gears a bit, but related to his current activities, he talked about possibly starting a medical advice bureau.
Really? Why?
His reasoning was quite specific. He feels there's a real lack of support for people who are caught up in, medical errors or facing disciplinary actions. He even mentioned his own run-in with something called a Tukrecht case in the Netherlands. I gather that's like a professional disciplinary board.
I believe so. Yeah, that idea for an advice bureau, it really points to what he sees as a gap. A lack of independent help for patients navigating the system, especially when things get messy or controversial.
And his personal experience probably fuels that.
Almost certainly.
Okay, let's broaden out again. He voiced some pretty serious worries about the whole socio-political climate.
Right. This is quite wide-ranging.
Yeah, the EU, NATO, what he perceives as this, march towards war with Russia. He even used the term new psychosis following the pandemic.
Wow. Did he give examples?
He shared an anecdote about someone, Badr Akima, apparently predicting Russia's moves accurately, and he contrasted his own view with others, like Arno Wenz and Hester Debye, who he says focus more on the EU's financial drivers.
So different interpretations of the same events.
Right. He used the analogy of a rolling train that's just hard to stop. He also offered his assessment of Putin thinks he's very calculated. Okay.
And he discussed the targeting of NATO advisors, mercenaries in Ukraine, mentioned Root's comments on the war's progress.
He seems to be following that very closely.
Extremely. He explained his view of Russia's strategy as a war of attrition, even quoting a supposed NATO advisor saying you have to destroy the enemy's army first.
Yeah.
And then he brought Trump into it, claimed Trump wanted a ceasefire because of rare earth minerals, but Putin rejected that.
Leading to Bonte predicting
A Russian victory. And America then pivoting its focus entirely to China. He used this comparison, saying China's steel industry is like 10 times bigger.
It's quite a sprawling analysis. What really strikes me is the scope. He's connecting dots between, virology, vaccine policy, geopolitics, international conflict.
It's all linked in his view.
It seems so.
Yeah.
His perspective paints this picture of interconnected global crises where maybe the pandemic response and the vaccine rollout are seen as just one piece of a much larger puzzle involving shifts in global power.
And potential conflict. Right. It's important, of course, to stress this is his interpretation of these incredibly complex world events.
Absolutely. And all this feeds into something quite personal he mentioned. He's actually considering leaving the Netherlands.
Oh, really? Why?
Several reasons. Housing prices, inflation hitting hard, the tax burden, but also deeper worries about the future for his kids.
Like what?
Specifically mentioning the potential for conscription, maybe needing to be outside the EU's sphere of influence for that. He also said his views are shaped by reading up on the history of U.S. foreign policy.
So it's a mix of the practical economic pressures and these broader anxieties about where things are heading globally.
Seems like it, looking at current trends through a historical lens and thinking about his family's future.
Understandable concerns, even if you don't share his specific geopolitical outlook.
Okay, let's finally pivot hard towards the core of this, the mRNA vaccines themselves.
Right. The central claims.
He starts by talking about this collaboration, Jonah Walk, Ronald Meester, Bram Baker, working with the RVM, that's the Dutch National Health Institute, right?
Correct. The National Institute for Public Health and the Environment.
And Bonte says they claim that the RVM's own internal data doesn't actually support the initial promises made about the vaccines. Safety, effectiveness.
That's a serious allegation.
Yeah. They argue, according to Bonte, that the RVM's defense of the whole campaign rests more on, belief or faith than on solid proof from their own numbers.
Wow. Okay, so that suggests a potential disconnect between the public messaging and perhaps what the internal analyses were showing.
That's the implication.
The idea that a major public health body's stance might be based on belief rather than hard evidence.
Right.
I mean, that definitely raises questions about transparency and the robustness of the evidence base, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And building on that, Bonte makes a very, very strong statement.
What's that?
He says this whole situation will become the biggest medical scandal of the century.
That's a huge claim. What's he basing that on?
He says it's based on 3 recent scientific publications that, in his view, confirm suspicions he's apparently held for about 2 years. Now, he does temper it slightly. He acknowledges that proving a direct causal link between a specific death and a vaccine is inherently difficult.
Which is true. Establishing causality in individual cases can be very complex.
But his assertion of a scandal seems to hinge on his reading of these new papers combined with his prior concerns.
So if he sees a pattern emerging, a growing body of evidence pointing towards potential harms, even without definitive proof in every single case, he feels it warrants that level of alarm.
That seems to be his position. He then shares some more personal anecdotes, stories about potential vaccine injury.
Okay, like what?
He says, just observationally, he's noticed more deaths among people he knows, his periphery, compared to before the pandemic.
Does he address age? People getting away?
He does. He acknowledges that's a factor, but he couples it with observations he's made during his presentations, though he doesn't specify what those are.
Right.
More concretely, he describes 3 specific instances where he personally believes individuals died from the vaccines,
Based on what?
based on their medical history, the symptoms they developed, and the timing relative to vaccination. And crucially, he says these deaths were not officially linked to the vaccine.
Okay. Unrecognized links, in his view.
Yes. And he also talks about cases of myocarditis, the heart muscle inflammation, that he claims were initially missed or unrecognized.
Mm.
He alleges that some cardiologists are now privately advising patients not to get further COVID vaccinations.
Privately?
Yeah.
That's interesting and concerning if true.
It is. He even tells a story about one patient who apparently sought his opinion, went against their doctor's initial advice, and was only later diagnosed with myocarditis after persisting.
These anecdotes, while obviously not scientific proof on their own, they do build a narrative, don't they?
Yeah.
Suggesting that maybe adverse events are being underreported or misdiagnosed.
That seems to be the picture he's painting. That private advice from cardiologists, if it's happening, is a particularly potent part of that narrative.
It definitely calls for more transparency, more investigation.
Then he brings in more systematic evidence, or what he presents as such. The Arne Burkhardt publication.
Ah, yes, the pathology report.
Right. It's described as a booklet covering 89 autopsy cases and 67 biopsies. Bonte makes a point of emphasizing the credentials of the pathology professors involved.
Okay, experienced pathologists.
But he also notes that their findings have apparently been rejected by their own professional association and others in the field.
So controversy surrounding their work.
Yes. And it's important, Bonte himself points out that for some of the cases in this booklet, the link to vaccination is actually stated as uncertain.
Okay, so not all 89 are claimed as definite vaccine links, even within that report. That's a crucial nuance.
It is. The Burkhardt publication, though, represents a more structured attempt to investigate potential vaccine-related deaths and injuries through autopsy and biopsy.
And having established pathologists involved does lend it some weight, even with the controversy and the uncertainties noted. The alleged rejection by peers also raises questions itself about the nature of the debate.
So, what are the key findings from Burkhardt's work that Bonte highlights?
Well, he emphasizes cases of people found dead unexpectedly or dying suddenly. And importantly, this includes younger individuals.
Okay.
He gives a specific example. A 29-year-old man presented with a headache, found in status epilepticus, basically continuous seizures.
And the autopsy showed?
A subarachnoid hemorrhage, so bleeding around the brain, but also generalized vasculitis inflammation of blood vessels throughout the body. And they found spike protein in multiple organs, including the testes.
Wow. Okay. Any other examples?
Yes, a 16-year-old girl
Yeah.
died suddenly after her second vaccination. He says initially it was dismissed as just a sore arm, a vaccination arm.
But later,
Myocarditis was confirmed. And again, spike protein was found, this time in her ovaries.
these are certainly alarming cases he's relaying. Finding spike protein in various tissues seems to be a recurring point.
It does. It's presented as a key pathological finding that needs explaining. How might the vaccine be leading to this kind of tissue injury? That's the underlying question.
He also pointed to findings in older people, people who already had health issues.
Yes, this was quite significant. Cases where the initial cause of death was listed as something common, like a heart attack or maybe an aortic rupture. But then a second opinion, a closer look pathologically, revised that cause of death.
How so?
They apparently found a direct link to the vaccination. Things like inflammation, specifically in the coronary arteries, or vasculitis in the wall of the aorta, again, with spike protein present.
And Bonte's point is
That these links might have been completely missed otherwise. If no one had taken that second, more detailed look specifically looking for vaccine-related pathology.
I see. It suggests potential underestimation in official statistics if this isn't standard practice.
Potentially.
Mhm.
He also mentioned one other, finding these unusual brown crystalline deposits found in vaccinated individuals.
A potential marker.
Yeah, he suggests it could be another microscopic indicator alongside the spike protein, potentially linked to the vaccination. Needs verification, of course.
Right. If that's consistently found, it could be significant for research.
Definitely. Okay, so based on all this, the RVM data claims, the anecdotes, the Burkhardt findings, Bonte then outlined 3 main areas of specific concern about the mRNA vaccines.
Okay. What's the first one?
DNA contamination.
DNA. In the mRNA vaccines.
Yes. He explains that plasmid DNA apparently used in the manufacturing process has been found in vaccine vials. And the amounts seem to vary quite a bit from batch to batch.
Was this known?
He says it was initially denied, but later confirmed. And the levels found are, according to him and the sources he cites, significantly higher than the accepted regulatory limits for residual DNA.
Okay, limits for DNA contamination exist then.
They do. But there's a crucial distinction Bonte highlights, referencing someone named Buchholz.
What's the distinction?
The existing limits are apparently for free DNA, just floating around. But the DNA found in the vaccines is inside those lipid nanoparticles, the delivery system.
Ah, so it's protected.
Exactly. Buchholz's point, as related by Bonte, is that this nanoparticle delivery protects the DNA from being broken down quickly by enzymes in our body. It gets delivered right into our cells.
Making the old limits maybe not applicable.
That's the argument.
Mm.
Bonte also mentions another researcher, Kevin McKernan, who claimed Pfizer tried to mitigate this DNA issue by chopping it up, but maybe used a method that missed smaller fragments.
And why does the size matter? Or does it?
Well, Bonte raises the concern about this DNA potentially integrating into our own host genome, and the argument presented is that this risk might exist regardless of the fragment size.
Integration into our DNA, that sounds serious. What are the potential consequences?
The main concern raised is long-term cancer risk. Bonte mentions Martin van Rossum assessing the risk as potentially comparable to smoking, though the timeline and how many people might be affected is unknown.
A comparison to smoking? That's stark. Any other evidence mentioned?
Yes, he says Kevin McKernan again, finding ongoing spike protein expression, meaning the cell is still making spike protein in a colon tumor biopsy taken a year after vaccination, and similar findings reported in aggressive stomach cancers.
So the DNA contamination concern revolves around manufacturing quality, the delivery method bypassing normal breakdown, potential integration into our genes, and a theoretical, unquantified long-term cancer risk.
That sums it up well. It's definitely a complex area needing rigorous investigation and transparency about manufacturing processes. The finding of persistent spike expression in tumors long after vaccination is also deeply concerning and needs explanation.
Okay, what's the second main concern Bonte raises?
This one involves a specific genetic sequence found in the vaccine plasmids, the SV40 promoter enhancer.
SV40, that rings a bell. Wasn't that linked to polio vaccines way back?
Exactly. Bonte points out its history as an unintended contaminant in some early polio vaccines, and crucially, that SV40 is known to have carcinogenic potential. It can contribute to cancer formation.
So why is this sequence in the COVID vaccine manufacturing process?
That's the question Bonte raises. He says its function there isn't clear, but specialists are worried because of its known ability to promote cancer in humans.
So it's not the SV40 virus itself being transmitted, right?
Correct. He clarifies it's not the whole virus. It's this promoter enhancer sequence. Think of it like a powerful on switch for genes. It can also act like an address label, potentially directing genetic material towards the cell nucleus.
And the concern is
that this sequence, if delivered into cells via the nanoparticles along with the plasmid DNA, could potentially integrate into our DNA and promote mutations or uncontrolled cell growth.
Did anyone else confirm its presence?
Bonte mentions Philip Buchholz again. Apparently, Buchholz initially denied it was there, but later confirmed its presence and expressed his own concerns about potential problems down the line.
So uncertainty and concern, especially about long-term effects, again.
Yes, particularly for children who receive the vaccine, as the potential for it to be an initiating step in cancer development might take many years to become apparent. The initial denial, followed by confirmation, also raises flags about transparency.
Okay, DNA contamination, SV40 sequence. What's the third major concern?
This one is about the type of antibody response generated by the mRNA vaccines, specifically Pfizer and Moderna. He says it's not seen with the viral vector ones like Janssen and AstraZeneca.
What kind of response?
An undesirable shift towards producing predominantly IgG4 antibodies over time, especially after multiple doses.
IgG4, what's the significance of that?
Well, Bonte explains we have different antibody classes. IgG1 and IgG3 are generally pro-inflammatory, good for fighting off infections initially. IgG2 and IgG4 tend to be inflammation dampening, associated with a tolerance.
Tolerance.
Yeah, to use the analogy of allergy shots, like for bee stings. The goal there is often to induce tolerance by shifting the response from inflammatory IgE antibodies to this IgG4 class. Your body learns not to overreact.
So the worry is, the vaccine is making the body tolerant to the virus.
Precisely. That this dominant IgG4 response might actually dampen the immune system's ability to effectively clear the virus upon subsequent exposure, making people more susceptible to getting reinfected.
Is there evidence for this shift happening?
Yes. He cites research showing that the immune response profile is different depending on whether your first encounter was natural infection versus vaccination. Vaccination, especially with boosters, seems to push towards a stronger, more persistent IgG4 response.
And does this correlate with reinfection?
Bonte mentions a study apparently showing that individuals with this high IgG4 response are indeed more susceptible to getting reinfected with SARS-CoV-2.
Though not necessarily getting sicker.
Correct. The study apparently didn't show increased severity, just increased susceptibility to reinfection. Bonte notes this outcome wasn't predicted. Early on, mentions a Belgian virologist who expected otherwise.
Are there any historical parallels?
He draws comparisons to the pertussis, or whooping cough, vaccine history. When they switched from whole cell to a cellular vaccines, similar effects of potentially increased susceptibility or transmission were observed later. Also mentions failed malaria vaccine trials, showing similar phenomena.
This ties into the idea of how viruses evolve too, right? The common belief is they get weaker over time.
Right, and Bonte addresses that. He says, while viruses can attenuate as population immunity builds and they mutate, it's not a guarantee. Omicron, for example, was still severe in populations with no prior immunity. He argues the mRNA vaccines, by not fully stopping transmission but reducing severe disease, created an artificial situation. Vaccinated people could carry and spread the virus, maybe even with high viral loads, without feeling very sick themselves.
You mentioned this before.
Yeah, he references a statement he made at a debate, the Wellsmers debate, about vaccinated nurses carrying high viral loads without symptoms.
And this relates to the leaky vaccine concept.
Yes, he brings that up, the controversial idea that vaccines that don't provide sterilizing immunity might, under certain conditions, drive the evolution of more virulent strains. He uses the analogy from Merrick disease in chickens, though acknowledges it's debated in humans.
It's complex. He also noted SARS-CoV-2 seems to hang around more than other viruses.
Yeah, he finds the frequent year-round circulation unusual compared to typical seasonal coronaviruses or influenza. He speculates this could be linked to the altered IgG4 dominant immune response in vaccinated individuals, perhaps affecting mucosal immunity, the first line of defense in the nose and throat.
Mucosal immunity. Interesting.
He briefly mentions an older, hard-to-find study on flu vaccines suggesting something similar. Asymptomatic spread with high viral loads in vaccinated individuals.
He brings up measles, too, briefly.
Just as contrast, mentions the known complication rate, the irony that unvaccinated adults might face worse outcomes now, because low circulation means less natural boosting. Contrasts RNA viruses like measles with DNA viruses like smallpox, which was eradicable partly due to no animal reservoir.
The main point being
the uncertainty. The long-term consequences of potentially altering population immunity via widespread vaccination on how viruses circulate and evolve are still largely unknown.
And he mentioned IgG4 disease and cancer.
Briefly, notes there's a condition called IgG4-related disease and ongoing research into links with cancer, but stresses there are no definitive causal links established yet. Okay, so that covers the three main concerns: DNA contamination, SV40, and the IgG4 response. What else did he discuss?
He elaborated on what he termed the third area of concern, direct tissue damage. This links back to the Burkhardt findings.
Oh, the pathology.
Yes. He mentions reports from doctors seeing illnesses they hadn't encountered before, possibly fitting under that umbrella term sudden adult death syndrome, or SADS.
Right.
And he reiterates that the pathological findings, the vasculitis, the spike protein in tissues, strongly suggest the vaccine as the likely cause in those cases.
Especially considering the dosage difference, he argues.
Exactly. Multiple doses of vaccine delivering spike protein systemically versus maybe one potentially limited natural infection. He brings up the principle, the dose makes the toxin here.
Makes sense. Did he comment on mixing vaccine types, like Pfizer, then Moderna?
He mentioned it, questioning the logic behind that strategy, suggesting there wasn't a clear rationale provided.
Okay. And he brought up those alleged RVM internal communications again.
Yes, circling back to that. Claiming that back in March 2020, the RVM internally stated that previously infected people wouldn't spread the virus.
Yet vaccination was still pushed for them.
That's his claim. And that discussions allegedly focused on manipulating data presentation to show better effectiveness in children. He mentioned a particularly jarring email suggesting excess deaths from COVID were over, and now the vaccines were, quote, working, implying they were the new cause of excess deaths.
If true, those communications are extremely problematic, raises profound questions about scientific integrity and public health messaging.
Absolutely. He then went into more detail on specific cases from the Burkhart findings, reinforcing the pathology points.
Can you recap some of those?
Sure. An 82-year-old, pre-existing conditions, developed severe nosebleeds, low platelets post-vaccine. Initial cause of death thought to be corona, but a second look revealed myocarditis, tiny areas of heart inflammation.
Okay.
A 75-year-old, initially diagnosed with sepsis. Second opinion, discrete myocarditis. He clarified myocarditis as inflammation of the heart muscle, often linked in these cases to spike protein expression in the heart's vessels and muscle tissue itself. Ruled out other common causes like heavy exercise.
Right.
57-year-old heart attack. Second opinion on autopsy showed epicarditis, inflammation of the heart's outer layer, and lymphocytic myocarditis. 61-year-old collapsed post-vaccination. Autopsy showed heart tamponade, fluid buildup, aortic issues, but also unexpected inflammatory infiltrates in various organs, including tests, and vasculitis in the aorta instead of expected age-related changes.
So systemic inflammation.
Seems like it. 81-year-old brain infarction, stroke. Showed odd black-brown material in liver cells, Kupffer cells, plus lymphocytic inflammation with vasculitis in the brain tissue itself. He explained vasculitis is immune cells attacking blood vessel walls, damaging them, making them prone to clots.
Thrombogenic, right?
Exactly. The 29-year-old again died in seizures, subarachnoid hemorrhage, generalized vasculitis, including brain and lungs, after 2 different mRNA vaccines.
A disturbing pattern.
Indeed. He mentioned the 16-year-old girl again, myocarditis after dose 2. A 24-year-old diabetic found dead at a train station, coronary artery clot, and myocarditis.
Even with diabetes as a risk factor, the findings were linked pathologically to the vaccine.
That's the implication from the second opinion findings he described. And then a particularly striking case. A healthy 40-year-old collapsed and died after just light exercise, pathology, myocarditis, and widespread vasculitis.
Just devastating stories, if accurately portrayed. The recurring theme is these second opinion pathological findings pointing towards vaccine-induced inflammation and spike protein presence.
That's the core message Bontu derives from the Burkhart report.
And what about solutions or reversibility? Did he address that?
He did, painting a pretty bleak picture. He asserts the damage, particularly things like myocarditis scarring or vasculitis effects, may well be irreversible.
Okay.
He points out the sheer impracticality of trying to screen the entire younger population for subclinical myocarditis, for example.
Yeah, that would be a massive undertaking.
He drew a historical comparison to the 1976 swine flu vaccine incident at Fort Dix, which led to cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, framing it as a past example of a major medical or public health blunder.
A cautionary tale.
Yes. He also lamented the perceived difficulty in getting research published if it shows negative findings about vaccine adverse events compared to, say, the volume of research on long COVID.
A potential publication bias.
That's what he suggests. He explained that while inflammation might subside if someone stops getting vaccinated, the resulting damage scarring in the heart, weakened blood vessels likely remains.
He used an analogy.
Yes, comparing it to Kawasaki disease in children, where the initial inflammation can resolve, but there's a known long-term increased risk of coronary artery problems later in life.
So the concern is about lasting damage and unknown long-term consequences.
Exactly. We just don't know the true prevalence of myocarditis or vasculitis or what it means decades down the line. He summed it up with the phrase, "Nobody wants to know."
A provocative statement, implying a lack of will to investigate fully.
That seems to be his implication. He stressed the need for recognition for more autopsy studies, even when prominent people die unexpectedly. But he noted awareness seems to be growing very slowly.
Why slow?
He suggested it's difficult for vaccinated individuals themselves to acknowledge the possibility of negative effects. And practically, he added, there's no simple advice doctors can give, like just take blood thinners, because the mechanisms are complex.
So potential irreversible damage, diagnostic challenges, alleged lack of will to investigate, and no easy fixes. That's a heavy message.
Very heavy. But he claims confirmation for his views is appearing in recent scientific literature.
Oh, like what?
He referenced a specific publication, said he'd just been sent it that morning, that apparently highlights concerns about the biodistribution of the lipid nanoparticles.
Where they go in the body.
Right. And concerns about potential long-term adverse events, the presence of spike protein and inflammation in blood vessels, noting it might be more pronounced in women.
And the conclusion of that paper?
According to Bonte, it calls for urgent global studies on the long-term safety profile of mRNA vaccines. And it apparently ends by saying ongoing evaluation is essential, despite acknowledging the vaccines were a critical tool.
Which Bonte sees as
Something that should have been established before mass rollout, that this level of uncertainty shouldn't exist now.
So even recent literature, he argues, is echoing the need for more long-term safety data, which he feels validates his earlier concerns.
That's his take. One more point, the spike protein found in some unvaccinated people.
Right, in that Japanese stroke study he mentioned earlier, how did he address that?
He clarified those were older individuals, over 70, who had likely only had one exposure to the actual virus. He contrasted that sharply with multiple vaccine doses delivering spike proteins systemically.
Reinforcing his dose makes the poison argument.
Exactly. He also briefly touched on the idea of shedding vaccinated people transmitting something harmful.
What did he say?
He largely dismissed it as unlikely to cause significant risk, probably due to mucosal immunity handling low-level exposure.
And declining birth rates.
He acknowledged the trend in highly vaccinated countries, but was careful not to claim direct causation. He used the term spurious correlation. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one caused the other. But he did circle back to the pathological findings of spike protein in tests in ovaries in some autopsy cases, suggesting that is a potential area of concern regarding fertility that needs investigation.
So acknowledging the correlation, but demanding biological plausibility and evidence before jumping to conclusions, while still flagging the tissue findings as worrying.
Precisely. So what were his final wrap-up thoughts?
Basically, that all this information, from his perspective, confirms the beliefs and suspicions he's held for a couple of years.
Did he address the anti-vax label?
Yes, he explicitly rejected it. He framed his stance not as being against vaccines in principle, but as being for good, thorough scientific research, the kind he argues should have been completed before the rollout.
Okay.
He made an analogy to a book called Dark Medicine, suggesting a potential for ethical compromises within the medical and scientific community when pressures are high.
Implying that might have happened here.
That seems to be the implication. He expressed absolute certainty that this will become a major scandal, regardless of what public opinion is right now.
And the damage?
He reiterated his belief that much of the potential damage is irreversible, and frankly, that there aren't really any alternative solutions or fixes available at this point.
A very definitive and quite somber conclusion on his part.
Extremely. It reflects a deep conviction in his interpretation and a significant level of concern about both the vaccines themselves and the way they were handled.
So just to quickly summarize the core of Jan Bonte's perspective we've unpacked today. He's raising serious flags about potential vaccine injuries, pointing to things like DNA and SV40 contamination.
Altered immune responses, like that shift to IgG4 antibodies.
And particularly focusing on those pathological findings, myocarditis, vasculitis, spike protein in tissues that he links directly to the vaccines based largely on the Burkhart report and other anecdotes.
Yeah, that's a fair summary of the key claims. And again, it's really vital we stress this. What we've done here is present one perspective, drawn from that specific interview, and the sources Bonte cited within it.
Absolutely. We haven't independently verified this information, and presenting it doesn't mean we endorse these claims as fact.
Our goal was clarity on his viewpoint.
We strongly encourage everyone listening to approach this critical. Please go out and explore this really complex issue further. Look for diverse, credible sources.
Yeah, understanding vaccine safety, assessing adverse events. It's incredibly challenging work, full of nuance.
It really is. Which leads us to maybe a final thought to leave you with.
Okay.
Given everything we've heard presented today from Bonte's perspective, what do you, the listener, think are the most critical, unanswered questions remaining about the long-term effects of these mRNA vaccines?
And perhaps more importantly, what kind of research, truly transparent, rigorous, independent research, would actually be needed to address those questions comprehensively and maybe help rebuild or maintain public trust in vaccination efforts moving forward?